Hello, welcome to this week's episode of CXNext Live. Great to have you join us. For those of you here for the first time, this is a weekly series. We focus on the world of customer experience, how you can create better outcomes for your employees and for your customers, even through challenging times like we're seeing currently with COVID-19. There's so much change we're facing today, and really for many folks out there, managing this perpetual state of the new normal can be a real struggle. And that can be both a struggle for employees of companies, whether they're going to the office or not going to the office, whether they're prioritizing things like digital channels and digital experiences, and many of the processes that once were normal are now kind of being turned on their heads. And all that then bleeds into a customer experience for how you interact with your customers, support your customers, and deliver them a great experience. And so what's interesting is, there are some commonalities across industries. So, certainly everyone's dealing with this pandemic and dealing with this change, but also things do vary from industry to industry. How retail's facing this versus travel and hospitality. There really are differences, but oftentimes those differences can lead to insights. And so what's really interesting from my perspective is, oftentimes, we come to work and we sit at our desks and we have a certain perspective based on our network or based on the work we do. But what's often interesting is when you go to a world like consulting, where we have people who are dealing with lots of different industries. Every day they kind of have a test bed or a laboratory to learn and explore and to better understand how companies are dealing with this new normal, with this perpetual state of change. And I think what's helpful there is we can take insights from all those different interactions, all those different conversations, from large consulting organizations or groups that are working with lots of different diverse companies, and garnish insights that we can take back to our own business. One, to improve how we support our employees, and two, to improve how we support our customers. So I'm really excited for my conversation today, where we're going to kind of dig into what are we seeing on the front line as the best in breed global consulting firms are out talking and interacting with their clients. And what are we seeing and learning? And also, how does that then tie into how we can take advantage of some of these trends to make them not challenges, but really ways we can improve our business over time. So without further ado, I'm really excited to invite this week's guest, Diana Dosik, to join to talk a little bit about her experiences, both in the front line and in some of the broader work she's done in the world of digital transformation, customer experience, and employee experience. So Diana, great to have you here. Welcome.
Thanks so much. Hi, Ryan. Thanks for having me on the show.
Yeah, it's great to have you here. I know I'm really excited. You bring such a wealth of perspective. You've done a TED Talk. You really, bring a lot of energy to the world of how do we take the complexity that many businesses are challenged with today and figure out how do companies better navigate that. But before we dig into those topics, I'd be interested in you sharing a little bit more about your background and kind of, where this passion comes from, and what are some experiences that led you to the work you're doing today?
Sure. So I'm a partner at the Boston Consulting Group, and I primarily focus on topics around people and organization. So thinking about how work gets done, what the culture looks like, and how employees can be best set up for success. And as you can imagine, these are critical topics right now for our clients, as leaders are very focused on how work is changing, how work can and should be done differently, both because of COVID, of course, but also because of trends that preceded COVID around fast changing technology, global markets and supply chains, and new attitudes about the role that work should play in our lives that were already starting to shift before this happened. It's a passion that I sort of discovered early on in my career. I've always been interested in how do people work? How do people become their best selves? How do they bring their most energetic and interested versions of themselves to work instead of just phoning it in, which sometimes happens, and it's not fun for anyone. It's not good for the employer, and it's not good for the employee.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think too often, I think it's easy for people to look at things like technology or look at things around like products, people look at those as the things that drive change, when often it really is about the people and the culture and the organizational structure. And many of those things kind of are afterthoughts to, we'll implement a new ERP system, or we'll implement some new technology, or a process that will fix many of our woes and challenges. When in reality, to your point, if people come into work and they're inspired and they're energized and they're feeling empowered, oftentimes they'll make the change, and many of the tools that you may have in place today can actually be accelerated. So I think it's a wonderful space that oftentimes kind of becomes, unfortunately, too far down the list when
Right.
companies are looking at making change.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when we look back even at historical major changes in technology, what we see is that the technology is invented, but it takes a much longer time before people are actually able to take advantage of it because it requires a new way of working, a new culture, a new way of operating around it. So when you think about, the steam engine and the Industrial Revolution, for a long time, people still worked in the old way with the new technology, barely taking advantage of it. And it really wasn't until the 1920s when people really realigned work around this new technology, built the assembly line, that you actually saw how do we take advantage of the technology we have. So completely agree between reformatting the organization and thinking about engaging people differently. That's where real change happens.
Yeah, that's great. I'm a big fan of the lean processes and lean methods, and there's a great term called a Gemba walk, which is when you walk down to see where the work's being done. So watch the employee doing the work, because it's too often too easy as a manager, as a leadership, to say, well, let's go implement this new technology or this new process or this what else, but then we lose that frontline perspective of what's actually happening, how's the work being done, and is this new methodology, this new technology effective and efficient, or we just kind of been sold a bill of goods and it's really not impactful. So I think that's wonderful. That's a really good perspective.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. We talk a lot, or I talked in my TED Talk a lot about the parallels between the customer and the employee. And it's very similar in that regard. I mean, we think about the energy that we already know to put into understanding how consumers interact with products. We go to their homes and study, how do you use the washing machine? How do you use the soap? What do you do to really understand how your product intersects with the person? So we know this intuition of, I need to understand behavior in order to really shape it, but we haven't brought as much of that as we could into the workplace, to really understand, what do my employees do every day? What are their workflows? What are they doing every day? And how can I shape that so that it's the best possible experience for the company and for them?
Yeah, I think really very well said, and I think that there's lots of examples of this, like cultural examples, in companies that we all aspire to be, of that leadership. I think of Southwest Airlines, from leadership down. There's this culture, this we empower our employees to make great customer experiences. But I think, to your point, sometimes it becomes a little more folklore or anecdotes versus kind of a method to the madness. And I think that's what I'm excited to dig into today. So you've set the stage well, and I think you bring obviously a wealth of experience. But as we kind of, let's say we narrow in the scope and we kind of zoom in our lens here on what's happening today, what are you seeing that really, you talked about there's some bigger, broader trends, and I think in COVID and this current environment has really accelerated some of those trends. So what are you seeing as the new normal, and how have you seen really work changing for companies over the last 3 or 4 months?
Yeah. I mean, what's amazing is that a new way of working had to be created instantly, which we've never had to do before, right? So we have this grand forced experiment conducted on a huge scale. And within weeks, companies that had been 100% on site went to 100% virtual, created new business models, went from eat in to delivery. So many examples of having to turn on a dime. And some of those changes are going to be temporary, and people are very much looking forward to a world where they can shift back. But others will probably stick around, especially as people find unintended benefits to some of the changes. So, for example, if you think about how both companies and employees have realized there's certain work that really can be done productively remotely, which is more pleasant for the worker when children are in school, which is a whole nother topic, but in theory, the flexibility is more pleasant for the worker and provides benefits to the employer. So as we see some of these things that work well just in general, they're going to stick around even after coronavirus has passed. So business travel is another good example. You're really seeing companies able to conduct more business than they ever thought through these digital channels, which of course ends up being better financially, better for the environment, often better for the employees who don't have to travel as much. So In terms of the new normal, I definitely see some of these changes in a positive way sticking and outlasting the current environment. And, similarly on the customer side, some of the changes are going to be hard to ignore. So the move to the online shopping experience, there are a lot of people who are doing more online shopping delivery than they've ever done before. And some of them will want to go back to an in-store experience, but some of them will find, especially for certain categories, that it's actually great to do all your shopping in your pajamas. And so I think we will see, several of our clients are already thinking about what are these long-term impacts? What are the things that I want to stick that we're really finding that we like? And what are the things that we'll have to shift back? And so in terms of the new normal, I think the companies who are able to take a breath and reflect through this period and actually see what is happening, what's good, what is bad, which I know is difficult in a crisis, but the people who are able to do that and absorb the lessons and think forward, I think are the ones who are going to be able to really emerge successful in the long run.
Yeah, I think that's great. And there's interesting, we had an episode a couple weeks ago where we talked about the world of like grocery and how, so much of grocery was driven through in-store. And, I even noticed that myself of, we'll do some grocery delivery services and we'll use, Peapod here in the Northeast or Roche Brothers. But there's also things like Instacart. And what was interesting is, during this, the initial surge, Instacart had like 500, 600, 700% increase. And Peapod and Roche Brothers did not because they had challenges around supply chain, in the sense of, they manage their own trucks, their own fleets. And so what I think is also interesting that you mentioned is, as we kind of get closer to the front line and hear what our employees are saying is to say, well, as a company, do I want to build capacity for that spike? Or are there new models I want to look at or new methodologies I want to look at that maybe help me address the spike, but knowing that that spike may only be, a month. And so I may not want to transfer my entire business and my people and my employee and my structure for a month, but I may say if there's a future spike or if there's a change in behavior, to your point, what are those systemic things, those long-term trends I want to capture? And then how do I help my employees identify those so we kind of remove some of the noise coming through the system of, big, massive change, people are reactive, to be like, well, what are those bigger, broader trends, whether, to your point, it's how employees work or changing customer behavior. So I think it's well said of those are the areas that I think companies really need to focus in on so they're not spending their time and energy on what maybe was just a flash in the pan.
Yeah. And I think you bring up an interesting point around, change is difficult. So what are the things that we really want to change versus not? But at the same time, I think we're seeing that more flexible systems writ large are going to be important, meaning that, the only constant is change, right? The oldest adage in the book. And we're seeing that ever more rapidly. Companies have to be even more prepared for constant change than they ever were before. Technology is changing at a faster rate. Habits are changing at a faster rate. And so being a company that is able to learn and adapt is actually, in our view, going to be more important than being the company with the right answer at any given time. So in the 1960s or 70s, if you had gotten the right strategy and you scaled around it, that could be a source of competitive advantage for a very, very long time. Fast forward to today, the right strategy is good for now, but strategies are going to have to change. So I do think there's a combination of not wanting to overwhelm people, but also needing to build that deep culture of resilience and the ability to pivot and experiment as just part of how you operate that will enable the best companies to move forward.
Well, and this is something that you and I chatted about previously that I think is a nice tie into this, is that one of the outcomes also that's come out of this pandemic is kind of the democratization of work or even remote work. And I think that's another interesting opportunity of, so much of the old way was, we have a headquarters that's in a location where there's a lot of subject matter expertise or expertise in our industry. And, we kind of draw from that talent pool in that location. And obviously the one everybody points to is Silicon Valley for the tech industry. But I think what's interesting now in this world of, being much easier to enable remote work is we can say, well, are there are employees all over the place who may have skills that are very relevant that we need, and they, to your point, may be changing. So the skills we need now may be different than what they're going to be in 6 months, 12 months from now. But by kind of making remote work kind of a first-class role, whereas in the past maybe it wasn't, that also allows companies to be much more flexible.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've actually been surveying and talking to a lot, not only of our clients, but some of these providers looking at quote unquote gig platforms like Upwork and TopTal and Cabinet and things like that. And there is a true shift in terms of the attitudes around whether someone works for the company or not, or works in that capacity because of this remote work. And perhaps this was not even realized at the time, but one of the big divides between a contractor and an employee was often this sense of the employee is in the office and the contractor works somewhere else. But when everybody is somewhere else, then you have this great democratization and the lines become much blurrier. And it gives you an opportunity to think about talent in a completely different way, to diversify, to get new skill sets, to think about new interaction models. And so we're seeing an explosion of creativity there as some of the old walls came crumbling down.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. And so this is a good transition then to our next topic of what were some of the other things that were underway that really kind of set up companies to be successful or to better adapt to this change? What were some of kind of you mentioned them, you touched them a bit, but you mentioned them early on, is there were already some kind of macro changes underway. Let's kind of talk through those and what you think were some areas that really set companies up for better success.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, as we said, coronavirus is mostly speeding up already existing trends as far as I can see. Obviously, there are some things that are new, but if you think about, for example, the datification of behavior. So this was already a direction that people were experimenting with, heading in, wearable tech, Alexa, GPS, how do we understand what people are doing? I do think the current time, though, has highlighted even more how useful that can be. So first, of course, in tracking the spread of the disease, we see these cell phone maps of hotspots and how does that move and how do we understand better what people are doing. But similarly, in remote work environments, how can we use data better to understand employee behavior instead of anecdotal feedback from managers, which is really exciting because the more deeply we understand what people do, as we talked about earlier, the more we can shape their behaviors and their environment to help them be more productive, be better teammates, learn new skills faster. And that aligns with another trend we were seeing around the war for talent. So the demand for great talent was already growing, but now we're seeing an even bigger crunch, especially around digital talent and talent that can really help move a company into the future. And so as the need for that increases, the need to create an interesting and high learning environment for employees also increases. So how do I provide a flexible work environment? How do I help employees learn and grow and become better at their jobs? And so that was already a trend, but it's even more magnified as companies have to rethink their talent pool and how they deploy it in this environment. And one thing about learning that I just think is a funny example, there's a conversation between a CFO and a CEO talking about training people and helping people learn. And the CFO said, what happens if we train all our people and then they leave? And the CEO said, well, what happens if we don't train all of our people and they stay? I thought it was a great, this idea of needing to invest in people in order to keep people and to keep people moving up the train of either your own organization, or even if they leave, this idea of alumni and thinking about a more holistic view of people leave, their ambassadors for your company, or they come back, or they become a client, or this much more fluid way of thinking about talent. These were trends that existed before, but I think people are taking a much harder look at them now that they are rethinking the employee value proposition overall.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I always say my rule of thumb is you can tell the quality of a manager by the success of their employees or the success of their direct reports. And to me, every manager's job is to get their employees, promoted within the company or promoted outside the company. And yeah, there's always once again I get kind of caught up in tech, but there's always these great examples of like all the people that came out of PayPal in the early days, or all the people that came out of there's these companies that just kind of were feeders of creating all these great leaders that went elsewhere. And even Google's also another great example. So yeah, I completely agree with that, and I think that going back to your point of there was a lot of this work already being done, but now we're taking it through the lens of democratizing it, of saying we want to make this work for everybody no matter where they are. It's not just creating a training program that's only offered at headquarters. It's now any employee can tie into this, and then also expanding our reach. So it's about making every employee feel like they're empowered and have the tools they need to be successful. And by doing that, now we can reach maybe employees that in the past wouldn't think about our company because they weren't closely located to a headquarters or to a location, or they were seen as to your point, a contractor versus a full-time employee. So I think those are all great examples. The one other thing that I know we talked about a little bit ahead of time that I'm interested in as well is you talked a lot about datafication of things and the lots of information we have, and certainly I think that's very relevant to the world of what's going on with restaurants, with hospitality, with even things like grocery. Are there other things we're seeing that versus, I think a lot of the datafication is pull of information. So let's look at historical trends. Are there other things companies are trying to do around proactive of trying to help, engage with consumers in new ways to drive new behavior versus just kind of looking in that rearview mirror?
Yeah, it's an interesting point. Just to make sure I follow, you mean in terms of looking at what they're doing today and based on...
Well, and you had talked about terms like nudging and things like where it's like, we're trying to, because I think a lot of it, the one challenge is things are moving so fast. It's sometimes hard to help the consumer or even help the employee know where they should be paying attention. So I even think about myself, it's like, well, that restaurant was closed last week. I like it a lot and I may want to go back there, but, I'm inundated with email, maybe I'm walking by and, so I think there's probably some unique opportunities for companies to try new ways of engaging their employees and consumers to help kind of promote or push the behavior that, is desired in this kind of dynamic environment.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think that we're seeing, especially with technology and the role that it's playing. So if you think about the levers that companies traditionally had to shape behavior, it was how do you design your store and how do you train your employees to interact with people? Those are really, some of the basic levers you had. Now that you are so deeply in their smartphone and potentially, what they look at, what they read, when they're looking at things, you have a real opportunity to shape behavior and get in at those moments when people are most primed to act. So on the consumer side, I think this is well known, when someone is looking at a certain shirt to sort of ping them with, this shirt is 30% off just today, and really get into those micro moments. But you can translate some of that into the employee experience, especially as people are more remote. They're interacting more through technology, which means you're able to create a more personalized experience because they're having a platform anyway. So sending me a message that says, hey, Diana, you completed these 2 trainings. It seems like you're interested in machine learning. These are the next 3 that would be interesting for you. You can do that in a way that you actually couldn't scale in the quote unquote analog world of, going to a session and then hoping you might learn something else later. So you have opportunities to interface with people not only more frequently through scaled nudges, that no human could have ever been on top of all of that, but also by being able to tailor to the individual. And so I think those 2 capabilities have immense potential. And the question is, are people well positioned to take advantage of it? So the leaders who really understand behavioral science, what shapes how people interact with the world, and really push their people to focus on that, I think will gain tremendous advantage. I think those who don't understand it well, it's very overwhelming. There are a lot of different things you could do. And so you really need to spend the time to understand what interventions work and make sure you're not overloading people with a million pings, because that also doesn't work. We all know.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. That's great. And I think that is a good point of, it's about, to your point, the technology's there. It's about what's the behavior you want to drive. And then how are you doing that way that's easy for the employee to consume and also gives you the insights you need of, is it effective, is driving the business outcomes you want. So I think that that's great. So for those of you that may have joined partway through, this is CXNext Live, a weekly series we do focused on the world of customer experience, helping to invest in your employees and your customers to deliver better outcomes. We talk about a wide variety of topics, from strategy through best practices all the way down through case studies. This week, we're focused on how do you invest in your employees in this new world to deliver better outcomes, whether that be business outcomes or outcomes with your customers. Diana joined me as a partner at BCG, and we're talking through a lot of the work she's done around employee investment, employee skills, capabilities. How are we investing in our employees, both from an organizational structure and a process, to help deliver better outcomes from them? And as many of us know, happy employees equal happy customers. And so we've talked through many of the changes that have come along with COVID-19, how it accelerated many trends that were already in market today. We talked a bit about how companies were already investing and how that set them up for success today, whether that be tools or processes or even better understanding their employees' needs. Dan, I want to transition now to, another very big topic is in the news is around diversity and inclusion. And I think many times when companies are in crisis mode, it can be easy to kind of lose track of some of the things that you say are important, but then sometimes can fall down the list because there's firefights and there's things to address, and we kind of fall back to some of our maybe bad habits, for lack of a better term. Mm-hmm. So I'm interested from your perspective on how are companies not losing sight of things like diversity and inclusion? And we've talked about inclusion from opening up our workforce to be anywhere, but obviously that inclusion also could be hiring people of color or people with diverse backgrounds that give us a broader, better perspective as a company. So I'm interested in hearing your perspective of what you're seeing with your clients and just in the broader work you've done around employee enablement.
Yeah, I think this is such a critical point, and I agree. In some ways, it can be overwhelming to think about anything other than the pandemic and the changes that requires right in front of you. In other ways, though, I think when companies are rethinking the employee experience in one way, it's actually a really opportune time to rethink holistically, because you're putting people through a lot of change anyway, and a lot of preconceived notions about what is supposed to happen are temporarily suspended, leaving room for all kinds of things. And so some of the changes that are required by the pandemic, if done well, you can actually kind of kill multiple birds with one stone. So we talked about, in a world when everyone's remote, suddenly you have new diversity opportunities if you learn how to take advantage of it, primarily geographically, but that also means like skill sets and countries and all kinds of things that you might not have opened the door to before. And then similarly, if you're doing more digitally enabled recruiting more broadly, for example, there are some really interesting startups that are doing evaluations. You can go online and take their test, and it's neuroscience, and it understands what your aptitudes might be and can really place you. And some of them are doing really interesting work around how that increases the diversity of your pool, because it takes out the bias of, well, I went to Harvard and he went to Harvard and he likes tennis and I like tennis, and it becomes more neutral. These are the aptitudes and the skill sets and the interests that would be good for the job you're looking for. And research has shown that that kind of more neutral assessment can give you a much more diverse field of candidates if done correctly. And so you actually have an opportunity. Okay, more digital recruiting is important in the pandemic, but also it's has the potential to yield these other results if you do it right. So I think you can be, even more attentive in some ways in a crisis than when things are flat and normal, because that becomes the one moment of change or the one thing that's changing. Right now, you have this moment where everyone's kind of open to a very new way of living, working. I mean, I think about the way I live today, and it is so different than the way I lived 5 months ago.
Yes.
In ways that no company could have convinced me to do just on their own in the old world, but like everything kind of has resettled. And so it is in some ways difficult to keep an eye on things outside the pandemic, but the companies that we are seeing are really forward looking, are trying to bring it all together and say, okay, if this is the solution we're implementing, what are the implications? What are the ways we can broaden it? What are the ways we can affect change in multiple areas of our business at the same time?
Yeah, I think that's great. And the couple things I like that you talked about is the taking advantage, like making the change an opportunity. And so much this too comes from leadership in the sense of, is leadership committed to it? And how are they then articulating that, and then how are they going to measure it? But I think, to your point, when there is change, it becomes a nice opportunity to then say, well, if we're going to be, if we're reprioritizing, digital as a method of acquiring new employees or engaging with employees, what can we do that would then lead to this other outcome? Because you're already going through that change process. Mm-hmm. And so I think that, once again, that's a really good point of companies need to, if they are prioritizing it, and we know that there's value in prioritizing it, that they say, okay, well, how do we then make this part of that change process? And how are we, once again, getting commitment from all levels of the organization, and then how are we going to measure it so that we can make sure we're successful on the other side of it? And so I think that's great. I think that once again, this is an opportunity, or we have the kind of the burning platform to make the change, and now it's about doing and measuring to get those results.
Yeah, and I do think that the companies where the leadership already had some of these things in mind are best positioned for success. So the leaders who already were thinking about diversity and inclusion, already were thinking about purpose, they're seizing the opportunity because they already wanted it, they already were pushing it, and this is just a great time to capitalize on it. So you see those leaders who have already been talking about how important these things are, trying to push these initiatives, are now the quickest to find creative ways to insert that into their new normal and their new way of operating. And so I do think there's an element of being prepared for this moment to then be able to take advantage of it, that we're seeing, differentiate the leaders from the laggards.
Yeah, absolutely. I will say, and I completely agree with you. I do, though, I do push companies to say, even if you haven't started the change, it's still worth it. So I think sometimes it can feel daunting to folks of, hey, it's like, I'm not a leader, I'm falling further behind. And I think there is some truth to that. But at the same time, I think that every change starts with one step. And so I'm not to take away from your comment, but I think that's one thing of, like, there are little things you can do that can make big change. And even if it's something as simple as an org structure or a role or a job description, or, once again, as you mentioned, there's plenty of great tools out there where you can kind of post your needs versus a job description, and then let the bias be removed, and let kind of those tools help you identify those better candidates.
Yeah. And I totally agree. And just an anecdote to even support that point, what sometimes can happen is that companies that are technically more advanced can get more calcified in a certain way of doing something, and then easily leapfrogged. So, if you think about the companies that built all of the telephone poles and telephone wires and, really had the leading infrastructure, it would seem impossible to beat, of course, until wireless comes along, and then you actually see companies able to leapfrog that. So the leaders who are cognizant of certain issues is really what I wanted to focus on. I think there are people, even small, nimble companies will actually be able to leapfrog in ways that large, maybe more bureaucratic companies can't when it comes to some of these changes. So I agree. I think there's massive opportunity at every level of the economy, but it's really about a mindset and being able to use this moment strategically, instead of being focused on just putting one foot in front of the other, as tempting as that is right now. I think that's going to be the big difference.
That's great. So I have two more topics I just want to have us touch base on. The first is, we've talked about so much change, and I mean, I feel it. You talked about it with yourself of, I'm working from home every day. We have 2 young kids here. My work environment's changed. I was traveling a lot prior to this. How can companies really support their employees, or what are the best ways companies can support their employees to help us all kind of navigate the current change we're living in, and kind of the next rounds of change over the next 12 months?
Yeah. It's a great question. And yes, I have two young kids at home. I'm actually 38 weeks pregnant with my third child. So I am working from home with a growing family. People are going through a lot right now. And I think the first thing companies need to do is to openly recognize that. And it sounds simple, but it's so important to just acknowledge that, we know working parents are having a lot of trouble. We know that some of our jobs might be disappearing and others are so overwhelmed they're working 24/7, and we know this is difficult. Even just acknowledging the isolation that people are feeling, it's so valuable to feel heard and understood. And when people don't say it out loud, it can feel like, do they even know, what I'm going through, or recognize that this is so difficult? So it sounds simple, but I think that's the first important thing. And I think what happens from that when you acknowledge it is that you then are able to listen and open the door for people to give you even more feedback. Yes, I am going through that. Here's the situation. Here's what's happening. And I think that listening is really important because you do have limited bandwidth. And so you want to make the right interventions and do the things that will actually help people in the short term and support them well. And that's going to be different, not only company to company, but in some ways employee base to employee base. The grocery workers who are very overwhelmed and working, worried about safety, are in a very different position than some of the, finance people who are worried that, their jobs are on the line, but they're working from home, which is very different than. So they're really different cadres, and you need a more personalized approach to how you support people. That being said, there are some, general good practices. I mean, we at BCG are really stepping up our mental health support and our coping support for employees across the board. We're doing a lot around tech support so that people can create a remote working environment that, at least from a tech perspective, works and isn't a source of additional stress. We're talking about even Zoom-based activities for children so that, working parents in the company have some options through the company to engage their children while they're at work. So I think there's a lot of things that seem small but can make a big difference. And the key is just learning and listening up front, similar to the whole theme we've been talking about. Understand your employees and what they do and what they want. That's how you'll get the most targeted and effective interventions. And it all starts with acknowledging the challenge people are facing so that they open up.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, so much of this is empathy. And the other thing I like that you touched on was that there is not kind of a one size fits all model. And that I think is a challenge for many companies of, we have some people who are frontline and essential workers, and, they're going to have to be in a store or in a hospital or in a location that, puts them maybe at greater, or does put them at greater risk, both in the sense of, they have to leave their home and they're more exposed to something like COVID. But then we have employees who are, working by themselves at home, whether that's with family or by themselves. And those also have a gamut of challenges. And so I think, to your point, there's common threads as we talk through our time today, but it's like going back to that, get close to the employee, understand their needs, show empathy of their needs, show them that you're listening. And that could be as a coworker, as a frontline manager, as middle management, and then certainly as senior leadership, but kind of getting a better sense of, what are those kind of core challenges for these distinct groups. And we did an interesting survey at Log Me In where we actually built some cohorts around this. So there was like a cohort of, people working at home with a family, people working at home by themselves, people that, were mission critical and, didn't maybe have the flexibility of others. And I think we ended up having 5 or 6 different cohorts. But there were a lot of insights that came out of that. And obviously not everyone in the cohort is exactly the same, but I think it at least helps broadly understand their needs. And it goes back to your point of, is it tech challenges? Is it work-life balance challenges? Is it mental health challenges? And it can be all those things, but then, knowing what those needs are. And I think I also like that you mentioned earlier, it's a good tie back, is that we've done a lot of these things in the world of consumers. Like we understand, we have personas for our consumers, and we understand their buying behaviors and their needs. And I think, once again, organizations are starting to see that level of rigor going into their employees as well. And to your point, this has been a real catalyst to drive it. The last thing I think that's interesting, I have a perspective on, is So we talked, a lot about the employee, and I think we talked a little bit about kind of frontline management. But from a senior leadership perspective, are there some things that, what does it really mean for senior leaders in organizations, and how should they be driving this? Should they be kind of, leading from the front? Should they be, very actively engaged? What are you seeing as best practices or recommendations that you're giving senior leadership to really navigate this?
Yeah, I think it's a really good point because it's bringing into focus, what is the model of a leader, and I think there's a sort of historical model in people's minds of a almost military Braveheart style commander, rallying the troops and having all the answers and leading people forward. And I think, again, back to the idea of what were trends before that are just being even more enhanced by the current situation, we'd already seen the beginnings of a new model of leadership, the idea of a more empathetic, more vulnerable, more fully human leadership. And I think that is coming very much into focus right now. And you're probably familiar with growth mindset and Carol Dweck's work, but this whole idea of being a lifelong learner and being someone who doesn't have all the answers right now, but is eager to learn the answers and to get the answers from people on the front lines, both customers and employees, I think is a model that we're seeing is much more powerful now. Not only because we said things are changing too fast, no one is expert enough to know everything up front or have magical intuition up front. So you have to learn and you have to be comfortable saying, I'm on a learning journey. But also, you have to make decisions quickly. And if you're the bottleneck, if you set yourself up as the supreme leader who has to make all the decisions, nothing can change fast enough to keep up with today's world. And so you have to spend more of your time learning and creating the context in which other people can make good decisions than being the person who has to make every decision. You want people to be positioned with the knowledge, with the right incentives, with the right capabilities so that they can make decisions on the ground quickly as they see things changing. If every decision has to go up through a long chain of command, through a tangle of bureaucracy, nothing is going to happen at the pace that it needs to. So I think the key is here for leadership are both this new mental model of what it means to be a leader and being comfortable that you're a lifelong learner, your employees are lifelong learners, and you're all competing on the rate at which you are able to learn and adapt. But that also, it's not your job to make all the decisions. It's your job to create the environment in which other people will make the best decisions they can. And that means you do different activities. It means you ask different questions. And it means you spend your time differently than you did in the past.
Yeah, and this to me ties really back to where we started our journey of, and by promoting that lifelong learning and the pushing down of decision making, you also then, one, you're empowering your employees because they feel like they can go make those decisions, but two, you're probably getting better insights faster from those bleeding edges, because to your point, those become small test beds. So now all those are testing and learning, and as you're gaining those insights, you can say, well, we're seeing really good results here. Let's index in that direction. And those results could be, business results, it could be organizational structure, it could be processes or tools or technology. But by pushing that decision-making down, you now create all these tiny little laboratories that are out learning and ideating and evolving. And then the best things will kind of bubble up, and then you can make pervasive if they're valuable to everyone, or you can keep them as, micro to that organization or that group or that specific geography, because it works well for them. So I think there's a lot of things that we've touched on that really become reinforcing loops out of the things you just mentioned.
Yeah, there's an author that I really like. His name is Frederick Laloux, who talks about it's moving from command and control to sense and respond. And I think what you're saying about the bleeding edge, part of your job as a leader is not to have all the ideas in your head and then force them onto people, but to sense from the bleeding edge, from the people on the ground, what am I hearing? What are the weak signals that the people on the front lines are transmitting to me? As individuals, they might not have time to really gather it all together, but I'm seeing something, I'm seeing a trend here, and I can help the whole organization respond to that. And so picking up on what's happening becomes a much more important skill than bringing a belief of I already know what's happening and
Yes.
pushing it down the organization.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, well said. And I think too, people oftentimes mix up like clarity of vision or clarity of here's where we want to go and why, like here's our mission, not the instructions, but the where are we all trying to get to. So people feel like they have a common goal and a common outcome, and they feel that it to me is what how you describe culture. It's where are we going and why are we going there. But the path they take, the journey and the process to me is not, to your point, let's keep that flexible and dynamic. So we have kind of clarity of this is who we want to be as a company. This is where we want to go. This is how we want to service our customers. But the road to get there, let's push that decision making down as far as we can inside the organization.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're seeing that even in more traditionally rigid institutions, for those of you who've read Team of Teams in the military world, which if anything
Yes.
is designed to have been top down and command and control,
Yes.
Especially the Iraq War and the stories there are incredible. You can't do that kind of, marching in phalanxes,
No.
across the line behavior anymore. And so how do you set the vision? How do you say, the strategically important goal is X, but then
Yes.
make sure that, platoons and troops understand that and can maneuver widely in order to accomplish those goals. So clarity on the why and why are we doing this and what is your team's goal in accomplishing
Yes.
that why is so important to communicate, but then giving them the tools to do it, but giving them the free range to do it in the way that makes sense on the ground, moment to moment, given the circumstances. You really want to enable people's best judgment and take advantage of it. Because if all you're doing is giving orders, you're not taking advantage of the strongest asset you have, which is the brilliance and energy and good judgment of the people you've hired. And we see, and as someone who focuses on people and organization, that's a core belief of mine, that people are at the heart of these businesses. People making their best decisions, bringing their best selves to work are what really elevate one company over another. So really being able to, as a leader, bring the best out of people and have them thinking all day about what the company really needs and how they can do their best in service of that. That's magic if you can get everyone that engaged. And I think that's a big piece that leaders struggle with today.
Yeah, well said. And I think it's a good capstone to our conversation today. Diane, I really enjoyed it. I think, as I mentioned earlier, often the people part of it, the employee part of it gets kind of pushed down the list to other things like quarterly business results and customer centricity and all those things. But at the end of the day, companies are their people. If everyone left, the company would be new if everyone new showed up the next day, even with a great brand or logo or whatever else. So I want to thank you so much for the time today. I really enjoyed the conversation. You've left a lot for folks out there to think about, a lot of good actionable insights I think people can take back to their work. And I want to thank you so much for joining.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me. And I hope you stay safe and well through this challenging time.
Yeah, and you as well. And congratulations on the new addition, the upcoming addition to your family. Yes. It's really exciting. Kids are a wonderful blessing, exhausting, but a wonderful blessing. And so best of luck to that.
Thank you.
And I want to thank everybody out there who joined this week's episode. This is CXNext Live, a weekly series we do focused on the world of customer experience, employee experience, and delivering great outcomes. Please check us back weekly. Feel free to send us comments or questions. We dig into these topics for all of you out there to help you deliver better experiences. And we thank you for joining. Please also take care. Send us any additional thoughts that you'd like us to cover in our upcoming week's episodes. And thanks a lot for joining. Talk to you again soon, and have a great day.